The summons arrived not as a sound, but as a vibration in the metal, a resonant frequency that bypassed the ear to rattle the very bones. For adept Kalen of the Martian Mechanicus, the subtle tremor in the deck plates of his hab unit was as clear and as chilling as a scream. He had been expecting it, and dreading it in equal measure. To be called to serve at the heart of the Imperium, in the shadow of the Golden Throne itself, was the highest honor a tech priest of his standing could aspire to. It was also, the Whispers warned, a one-way assignment, a lifetime sentence in a gilded tomb. He found his friend and fellow adept, Corvin, waiting for him at the transit hub. The vast chamber echoed with the hiss of pneumatics and the low chant of binary hymns from passing servitors. Corvin's optic lenses whirred, focusing on Kalen with an uncharacteristic intensity. He offered a data slate, a simple volume of Martian philosophical treatises, but the gesture was heavy with unspoken meaning. Their last conversation was a silent exchange of looks, a tightening of the jaw, a shared understanding of the honor and the horror that awaited. Corvin's final, almost imperceptible nod was not one of congratulation, but of farewell. The descent was a journey through layers of sanctity and paranoia. The gleaming upper spires of the Imperial Palace, bathed in Terra's weak sunlight, gave way to deeper, older levels where the air grew thick with incense and the ozone tang of powerful machinery. Lumens cast long, stark shadows, and every archway was a fortress manned by custodians whose golden armor seemed to drink the light, their silent, immobile presence more intimidating than any challenge. The deeper he went, the quieter it became, until the only sounds were the hum of his own augmentations and the whisper of his robes on the polished stone. The silence was not empty. It was a physical pressure, a weight of ages and secrets. His destination was a stark, utilitarian chamber where Overseer Gal received him. The man was a silhouette of sharp angles and cold metal, his face a pale, severe mask beneath a crimson hood. There were no pleasantries, no words of welcome. Gal's voice was a dry rasp, like stone grinding on stone, as he listed Kalen's duties in the Golden Throne's maintenance cadre. The instructions were a litany of absolutes and prohibitions, each one underscored by a cold, fanatical certainty. The reception was less an induction and more a branding, impressing upon Kalen the absolute nature of his new existence. Obedience was doctrine. Curiosity was heresy. Finally, he was led to an observation platform, a protruding lip of rock and plasteel high in a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in gloom. And there, in the impossible distance, was the Golden Throne. It was not merely a machine or a chair. It was a mountain of gilded machinery, a cathedral of wires and conduits, pulsating with a soft internal light. It dominated the space, a terrible end. Magnificent engine of faith. But it was the sensation, not the sight, that seized him. A low psychic hum vibrated through the air, a subsonic thrum that set his teeth on edge and made the fillings in his bones ache. It was the sound of power beyond comprehension, the breath of a god, and it carried within it the faint, eternal echo of a scream. In that moment, the honor he felt was eclipsed by a cold, sinking foreboding, a certainty that he was standing at the precipice of something from which his soul would never fully return. The silent servitor that met him at the platform's edge was a thing of polished bone and bleached metal, its humanity long since scoured away by ritual and circuitry. It turned without a sound and began to walk, its mechanical limbs moving with a fluid, unsettling grace. Kalen followed, his own footsteps a clumsy echo in the vastness, the psychic hum from the distant throne now a constant companion, a pressure building behind his eyes with every step deeper. into the labyrinth. The corridors they navigated were a stark contrast to the ordered doctrinal precision of Mars. Here, the architecture was ancient, a chaotic accretion of millennia. Decaying archways carved with forgotten heraldry gave way to brutalist plasteel reinforcements. Conduits and cables snaked across vaulted ceilings like metallic ivy, some glowing with a faint inner light, others dark and dead. The lumens set into the walls flickered erratically, casting stuttering shadows that danced like mad things. In their intermittent light, Kalen saw the stains of ages on the stone, discolorations that could have been oil or soot or something else entirely. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of static, sanctified oils and the faint, sweet odor of decay. The pressure intensified, a psychic tide washing against the shores of his mind. It began as a dull headache, a persistent throb at his temples, but soon it blossomed into something more. Vivid, unbidden flashes seared. Across his vision, he saw 1,000 faces contorted in silent screams, their features melting like wax under an invisible heat. He felt the ghost of a cold metal restraint on his own wrists, the bite of a needle in his neck. These were not his memories, but echoes, the psychic residue of the countless souls who had passed this way to fuel the unending hunger of the throne. Each sacrifice had left its mark, a scream frozen in time, and he was now walking through a gallery of their agony. His mind, seeking refuge from the onslaught, retreated to the sterile, logical halls of his training on Mars. He remembered the red planet's surface, a landscape of perfect, rust-colored order. He recalled the chant of the binary choirs, the precise click of gears, the absolute certainty of the machine god's logic. On Mars, every circuit had a purpose, every equation a solution. It was a universe of clean lines and predictable outcomes. Here there was only chaos, a spiritual and physical entropy that defied all reason. This was not the ordered worship of the Omnissiah. This was a desperate, bloody struggle against the dark, a practice of horror sanctified only by its necessity. Overwhelmed, he stumbled, his gloved hand shooting out to brace himself against the cold, damp stone of the wall. The contact was electric. The psychic pressure, previously a diffuse assault, suddenly focused into a single, searing point of contact. A torrent of raw, undiluted emotion flooded into him, not just the fear of sacrifice, but the profound, soul-crushing agony of the act itself. He felt the moment of unmaking, the tearing asunder of a consciousness, the infinite terror of being unmade for a purpose too vast to comprehend. It was the residual pain of 1,000,000,000 souls, a psychic scar etched so deep into the very rock that 10,000 years had not faded it. He snatched his hand back, his breath catching in his throat, the phantom sensation of that collective suffering burning against his palm. The silent servitor paused, its blank optic lenses regarding him without judgment, waiting for him to continue his journey into the heart of the screaming dark. Senior Adept Vorel was a man carved from the same cold stone as the chamber he commanded. His augmetic eyes, twin lenses of polished crystal, swept over the control consoles with a dispassionate rhythm, missing nothing. He spoke to Kalen in a monotone, his voice a low hum that barely competed with the pervasive thrum of the golden throne itself. The lesson was not one of theory, but of doctrine. Kalen's duty was to monitor the river of energy that flowed through the throne's arcane conduits, a task requiring not understanding, but unwavering vigilance. The glowing schematics on the main console depicted a system of such complexity it made the logic engines of Mars seem like child's toys. Rivers of gold represented the Emperor's will, channels of crimson the psychic input of the sacrificed, and veins of cold blue the life support. systems that sustained the decaying form upon the throne. Voral's instructions were clear. The flows were to remain within proscribed parameters. Any deviation was to be reported, but only after consultation. Initiative was a spark that could ignite heresy. For hours, Kalen watched the luminous streams, his mind struggling to find patterns in the beautiful, terrifying chaos. The psychic pressure was a constant, a physical weight on his chest, but he learned to breathe through it, to let the screams that echoed at the edge of his hearing become a part of the background noise, like the hum of a distant engine. Then it happened. A single crimson channel, representing the soul energy of the most recent batch of psychers, flickered. It was a minute anomaly, a barely perceptible dip in luminosity that lasted less than a second before stabilizing. Kaelin's enhanced optics registered it instantly, a statistical blip in an ocean of data. He turned to mention it to Voral, but the senior adept was already watching him, his crystal lenses unmoving. Before Voral could speak, the silence of the chamber was shattered. Not by sound, but by a psychic blast that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the soul. Where there had been a low hum, a single, piercing scream erupted inside Kaelin's skull, a sound of such pure, unadulterated terror and agony that it froze the blood in his veins. It was the scream of a soul not just being consumed, but being unmade, its very essence torn into screaming fragments. The vision that accompanied it was a flash of a young face, eyes wide with a horror beyond comprehension, a mouth open in a silent plea that became this psychic shriek. The console before him swam, his stomach lurched, and he had to grip the edge of the panel to keep from falling. Voral's hand was on his shoulder a moment later, the grip like iron. The senior adept's face was a mask of cold disapproval. He had felt nothing. To him, it was merely a fluctuation, a minor hiccup in a process that had continued for 10,000 years. He dismissed it with a wave of his hand, his monotone explaining that the machine spirit was vast and sometimes belched, that the souls of the faithless sometimes struggled against their holy purpose. It was nothing. It was to be ignored. The doctrine was clear. The machine's parameters were stable. The scream was irrelevant, but Kaelin could not unhear it. The echo of that singular moment of torment reverberated through his mind, a crack in the facade of holy purpose. His hands trembled as they returned to the console. The logical part of his brain, the part forged on Mars, screamed at him to obey, to fall in line with the senior adept's doctrine. Yet the memory of that psychic scream was a more powerful imperative. It was a truth that doctrine could not erase. With a resolve that felt like heresy, his fingers danced across the data slate, accessing the log. He did not report it. He recorded it. In precise, technical language, he noted the time, the specific conduit, the energy dip, and appended a single stark addendum, concomitant psionic event of significant magnitude. He had barely entered the final glyph when Voral was at his side, the air around him growing cold. The senior adept's augmetic eyes stared at the log entry, and for the first time, Kaelin saw a flicker of something other than dispassionate duty in their depths, a cold, hard anger. Voral's voice was a low, dangerous thing, no longer a monotone but a blade of ice. He did not question the data. He questioned the act. The transgression was not in what Kaelin had seen, but in what he had dared to record. Obedience was the highest form of worship. Questioning the sacred processes of the Golden Throne, even with a data entry, was the first step on a path that led only to damnation. The tension between them was now a physical thing, a new layer of pressure in the already suffocating chamber, the ghost of a scream hanging in the air between the veteran who obeyed and the novice who dared to listen. The silence in the Sanctum Imperialis was never truly silent. It was a canvas upon which the machinery painted its endless, groaning symphony. But during the long, solitary vigil of a quiet shift, when even the heavy footfalls of the custodians were absent, and Senior Adept Vorl had retired to his cells, the nature of that silence changed. The background hum of the Golden Throne deepened, becoming less a sound and more a vibration that resonated in the hollow of Kaelin's chest. It was into this amplified quiet that the new sounds first bled through. He was calibrating a tertiary plasma regulator, his hands moving with the automatic precision drilled into him on Mars when he heard it. Not a scream this time, but a voice. It was faint, a whisper of static from a nearby grill, yet impossibly clear. "Please, my daughter." The words were saturated with a despair so profound it felt like a physical chill. Kaelin froze, his tools hovering over the console. He scanned the chamber, his enhanced optics piercing the gloom, finding nothing but banks of dormant machinery and the ever-present, pulsating glow of the throne in the distance. The voice was gone as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the hum. He tried to dismiss it as fatigue, a psychic echo his weary mind had given form. But then another came, this one from a different direction. A low, guttural curse spat with a hatred that had survived death itself. "Rot in your gilded cave." The venom in the psychic imprint was so potent it left a coppery taste in his mouth. Over the next hour, the whispers multiplied. They were not the unified scream of the feeding ritual, but individual voices, distinct personalities fractured and trapped within the throne's impossibly complex systems. Some pleaded for mercy, others raged against their fate. A few simply wept with the broken exhaustion of souls stretched across millennia. They were the sacrifice psychers, their consciousness not fully extinguished but woven into the very fabric of the machine, their eternal torment the fuel for a dying god. His faith, a structure of steel and ritual, began to groan under the weight of this new reality. The Emperor was the Omnissiah, the god of mankind. His silence was divine, a focus so absolute it transcended mortal communication. But what Kaelin heard in these whispers was not divinity. It was damnation. Was the Emperor's silence a state of transcendent grace, or was it the silence of a being trapped in an unending cycle of agony, unable to speak through the pain? The conflict between the doctrine he had sworn to uphold and the horrifying evidence of his own senses created a fissure in his soul. Driven by a compulsion he could not name, he abandoned his post. He moved towards a bank of large ventilation shafts, their grills thick with the dust of centuries. The whispers seemed strongest here, as if the stale, recycled air carried their breath. Kneeling, he ran his fingers over the cold metal of one grill, his sensors detecting faint, anomalous energy readings, the psychic residue of countless passings. Using a Laz cutter from his belt, he carefully severed the rusted bolts and pulled the grill away. The shaft beyond was a dark, square throat exhaling air that smelled of ozone and old bones. He crawled inside, the space tight around his robed form. The light from his palm-mounted lumen cast long, dancing shadows on the duct walls, and that was when he saw them. Etched into the metal, not with tools but with fingernails or sharpened rock, were words. They were layered over one another, a palimpsest of despair left by those who had come before him. "The throne consumes all," one read, the letters jagged and frantic. Another, carved with a chilling precision, stated, "He feels every moment." Further in, he found a single, stark sentence that made his blood run cold. "We are not feeding a god, we are torturing a corpse." These were not the writings of heretics, but of adepts, his predecessors, the men and women who had sat at these same consoles and heard these same whispers. They had known. They had all known, and this hidden, desperate archive was their only testament, their only rebellion against the crushing weight of the truth. Kalen traced the grooves of the final etching, his own faith crumbling to dust in the dark. The Emperor's silence was not a mystery to be revered. It was a scream trapped behind a wall of gold, and he was one of the masons, diligently adding another brick, ensuring the horror would never end. The chime that signaled the ritual was not a sound of bells, but a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the deck plates and up through the bones of every adept in the chamber. It was a call to witness, a mandatory observance that even senior adept Vorel could not excuse. Kalen followed the stream of crimson robes to the processional gallery, a high balcony that overlooked a circular, metallic amphitheater far below. The air here was different, thick and heavy, charged with a psychic potential that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. The low, constant hum of the throne had intensified into a hungry, anticipatory drone. Below the amphitheater was a study in stark, brutalist geometry. At its center was a raised dais, upon which sat a complex arrangement of gleaming brass and silver machinery, the sole engines, the direct conduits to the golden throne itself. They were beautiful and terrible, covered in intricate scrollwork that depicted saints and angels, their mouths open in song or scream. Kalen could no longer tell. A column of intense white light shone down upon the dais, illuminating the motes of dust and ash that perpetually danced in the air. A heavy door hissed open on the far side of the chamber, and the first of the psychers was led in. They were a sorry procession, clad in simple gray shifts, their hands bound not with chains but with glowing manacles that suppressed their power. Their faces were pale, hollowed out by fear and the long journey to this, their final destination. Some walked with a dazed, vacant expression, their minds already broken by the psychic pressure of the place. Others trembled violently, their eyes wide with a terror so absolute it was a physical force. A few wept silently, their tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on their cheeks. They were the Imperium's tithe, 1,000 souls a day, the fuel that staved off the darkness for another sunrise. The first psyker, a young man with lank, dark hair, was guided onto the dais by a silent, implacable servitor. He did not struggle. He seemed resigned, his shoulders slumped in an exhaustion that went deeper than bone. The machinery came to life with a series of soft, precise clicks and a rising hum. Articulated arms of polished metal unfolded from the central apparatus, gently but firmly positioning the young man within a constellation of glowing lenses and focusing rings. Kalen held. His breath, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the psyker's psychic signature, a faint, flickering candle flame of consciousness, even from this distance. There was no grand explosion, no burst of light. The dissolution was horrifying in its quiet efficiency. The column of light intensified, and the young man's form began to unravel. It started at the edges, his outline blurring as his physical substance disintegrated into shimmering motes of golden dust. There was no sound from his throat, but Kalen felt it, a psychic shriek that tore through the ether, a wave of pure, undiluted agony as the soul was violently separated from its mortal shell. The body dissolved completely, the golden motes swirling in the light before being siphoned into the hungry maw of the soul engine. The psychic essence, that flickering candle flame, was the last to go. Kalen felt it as a tearing sensation, a hook ripping through the fabric of his own mind, as the young man's consciousness was ripped away, stretched into an impossibly thin scream and consumed. The taste of ozone and something sweetly rotten filled the air. The visceral horror of it, the feeling of that soul being flayed alive in the ether, was too much. A violent nausea racked Kaelin's body. He turned from the balcony, his stomach convulsing, and vomited onto the polished stone floor. The acidic burn in his throat was a welcome, real sensation amidst the psychic horror. He wiped his mouth with a trembling hand, his body shaking with revulsion and a profound, soul-deep shame. Forcing himself to turn back, he watched the next sacrifice. A woman this time, her head shaved, her eyes burning with a fierce, defiant intelligence. As the servitor guided her onto the dais, her gaze swept the gallery of watching adepts, and it locked with Kaelin's. In that frozen sliver of time, a connection snapped into place. He saw not just her fear, but her understanding. She knew what he was, what his role was in this endless cycle of consumption. She knew he was a part of the machine that was about to erase her, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of his own terror, the terror of comprehension. It was a moment of shared, damning knowledge, a silent acknowledgement of the horror they were both trapped within. Then the light enveloped her. Her body began to dissolve, but her eyes remained fixed on his for one last, eternal second, wide with a final, psychic plea before her consciousness was torn from the universe with a silent, psychic detonation that left Kaelin's mind ringing with the echo of her extinction. The stench hit him first, a sharp, acrid tang of ozone that cut through the usual smells of sanctified oils and cold stone, underlaid by something else, something foul and organic that reminded Kaelin of a neglected morgue. He was deep in the subconduit accessways, a cramped, low-ceilinged labyrinth of pipes and cables that formed the Golden Throne's circulatory system. His task was routine. Diagnostic sweep of the primary energy conduits, a ritual of maintenance as old as the throne itself. The glow globes attached to his shoulders cast a sickly yellow light on the dripping, condensation-slick walls, their illumination seeming to recoil from the shadows that clung thickly to the corners. He followed the foul odor to its source, a junction where three massive, gold-plated conduits met. The sacred sigils etched into their surfaces were blurred, their edges softened by a creeping, blackish corrosion that wept a viscous, iridescent fluid. Where the fluid dripped onto the deck plates, it sizzled and ate into the metal, leaving pitted, weeping sores in the adamantium. This was not simple wear and tear, not the gentle entropy of time. This was a sickness, a cancer eating at the heart of the machine. The air around the junction crackled with unstable energy, and Kaelin's auspex chirped a frantic, high-pitched warning, its reading spiking into the red. He reached out, his gloved fingers hovering just above the corrupted metal. He could feel a malignant heat radiating from it, a feverish pulse that seemed to beat in time with the throne's distant psychic hum. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the accessway. Senior Adept Vorl emerged from the gloom, his crimson robe seeming to absorb the weak light. His crystalline eyes immediately fixed on the corrupted junction, then shifted to Kaelin's auspex, still bleeding its alarm. Kaelin, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and horror, began to report his findings, gesturing to the weeping corrosion, the unstable energy readings, the undeniable evidence of systemic decay. Vorl's reaction was instantaneous and absolute. He did not look at the corrosion. He looked only at Kaelin, his expression a mask of cold fury. His hand shot out and slapped the auspex from Kaelin's grip, sending it clattering against the wall where it fell silent. His voice, when it came, was a low, venomous hiss that carried more threat than any shout. He did not dispute the evidence. He condemned the observation. To suggest the Golden Throne, the divine engine of the God Emperor, could fall to decay was the purest heresy. It was a failure of faith, a weakness of spirit. The machine spirit was testing them, and Kalen had failed. The only corruption, Vorl insisted, his augmetic finger jabbing towards Kalen's chest, was in the mind of the adept who dared to see it. The doctrine was clear: the throne was eternal. To believe otherwise was to court damnation. Chastised and seething, Kalen was ordered to continue his sweep, to ignore the phantoms his weak faith had conjured. As Vorl's footsteps receded, a cold, defiant resolve solidified within him. The doctrine was a lie. The evidence was here, weeping from the pipes. While his hands performed the rote rituals of cleansing and anointing on an adjacent, clean conduit, his mind was racing. He could not let this go. He had to know. When he was certain he was alone, the only sound the drip, drip, drip of the corrupted fluid, he acted. Using a microlaser from his toolkit, he carefully excised a small, coin-sized fragment of the corrupted conduit from a section hidden in shadow. The metal was brittle and came away easily. As it fell into his palm, a jolt of energy, cold and invasive, shot up his arm. The fragment was unnaturally heavy for its size, and it pulsed with a slow, rhythmic throb like a diseased heart. It felt alive and deeply malevolent. The sensation was not of a machine failing, but of something festering. He concealed the shard within a hidden compartment of his robe, the malignant pulse a secret counterbeat to his own heart as he returned to his duties, now a guardian of a truth more terrifying than any heresy. The truth of the Golden Throne was not in its schematics or its energy flows, but in the flesh it sustained. Kalen had been assigned to recalibrate a bank of sensor arrays positioned on a gantry that arched high above. The main chamber, a spiderweb of plasteel and adamantium that offered an unobstructed, terrifyingly clear view of the throne's heart. For days, he had worked with his back to it, feeling its psychic weight like a sun on his neck, but never daring to turn. Today, the task demanded it. A misaligned optic needed a direct line of sight to the source, and as he adjusted the final focusing ring, his gaze was drawn inexorably upward, and he saw. The Emperor of Mankind was a skeleton draped in parchment. The form seated upon the colossal, machinery-encrusted throne was not the radiant, god-like figure from the ecclesiarchy's tapestries. It was a withered effigy, a thing of sticks and sinew. The skin, stretched taut over a prominent skull and jutting bones, was the color of old ivory, stained with patches of jaundiced yellow and livid purple. It was not whole. In places, the flesh had receded entirely, revealing the stark, yellowed bone of a cheekbone or a clavicle, like ancient ruins emerging from barren soil. Across the chest and limbs, weeping sores wept a thin, clear fluid that glistened in the throne's internal light, tracing slow, sticky paths through the dust that coated the imperial form. Wires and tubes, like metallic parasites, burrowed directly into the flesh, pumping fluids and channeling energies, their points of entry inflamed and swollen. And the stench. It crept through the filtered air of his helmet's rebreather, a faint but undeniable ghost of corruption. It was the sweet, cloying odor of necrosis, of meat left too long in the sun, mixed with the sterile, metallic tang of the preservative fluids and the ozone of raw power. This was not the incense-swathed fragrance of a god, but the smell of a terminal ward, of a body losing its long, agonizing war with entropy. Kalen's hands fell away from the sensor array, his tools forgotten. His devotion, a structure painstakingly built over a lifetime of training and prayer, cracked. This was not divinity. This was a medical atrocity. The God Emperor, the beacon of all humanity, was a corpse on life support, rotting in plain sight beneath a mountain of gold. The horror of it was absolute, a vacuum that stole the breath from his lungs and the faith from his heart. As he stared, transfixed by the grotesque reality, he felt a pull. It was not a physical force, but a psychic hook that sank into the core of his consciousness, gentle yet inexorable. The cacophony of screams and whispers that perpetually filled the chamber seemed to part, and in that sudden, terrible clarity, a single fragmented thought imprinted itself upon his mind. It was not a word spoken in a voice, but a concept, a feeling of absolute desperate isolation and anguish, transmitted with the faint, fading strength of a dying star. Help, the thought was gone as quickly as it had come, the psychic noise of the chamber crashing back in. But its echo remained, seared into Kaelin's soul. It had not been a command from a deity. It had been a plea from a prisoner. The horror of the physical form was now eclipsed by the greater horror of the consciousness trapped within it, a mind, perhaps still vast and powerful, but reduced to this single, desperate fragment of a thought, sent out into the void for 10,000 years. Kaelin stumbled back from the gantry's edge, his body trembling. The image of the rotting form was burned onto his retinas, and the psychic plea was a bell tolling in the depths of his mind. The divine mystery was a lie. He was not serving a god. He was tending the tomb of a suffering man, and his devotion had just become a form of complicity in an eternal, silent scream. The knowledge was a poison in his veins, and the only antidote was more poison. The sight of the decaying form and the psychic plea for help had shattered the last vestiges of Kaelin's doctrinal certainty, leaving a raw, desperate need for truth in its place. He could no longer trust the sanctioned logs or the placating words of Senior. Adept Vorel. He needed to know what others, those who had stood where he now stood and seen what he now saw, had discovered. The whispers of the previous adepts, etched into the ventilation shafts, were a trail of breadcrumbs leading into a darker forest, and he had no choice but to follow. He found the archive by accident, or perhaps it found him. While tracing a faulty power conduit in a disused sublevel, a section of wall had shifted with a groan of protesting stone, revealing not a maintenance hatch, but a narrow, dust-choked crevice. The air that sighed out was ancient and dry, carrying the scent of ozone and brittle parchment. It was a space forgotten by design, a void hidden within the immense architecture of the palace. Inside, illuminated by the single, guttering lumen globe he carried, was a treasure trove of heresy. It was not a library of data slates, but an ossuary of knowledge. Piles of crumbling scrolls, their parchment flaking at the touch, were stacked next to crystalline data wafers so old their edges had begun to fog. It was a collection of contraband truth, a secret history of the throne written by those who had dared to look behind the veil. He spent his off-shifts there, a ghost in a tomb of ghosts. The first data log he accessed was from an adept named Lysander, dated 3 centuries prior. The script was frantic, the language a mix of technical jargon and terrified poetry. Lysander described the throne's energy matrix not as a stable, holy construct, but as a failing star, its core oscillations growing increasingly erratic. He recorded fluctuations that Vorel would have called impossible, power surges that bled into the warp and threatened to tear the fabric of the sanctum asunder. The final entry was a single, scrawled sentence. "The light is dying. The silence is a lie." Another log, this one from a woman named Alara, spoke of the Emperor's consciousness not as a unified divine will, but as a shattered mirror. She theorized that 10 millennia of constant agony and the strain of holding back the tides of the warp had fractured the master of mankind's mind. His thoughts were not commands, but fragments, echoes of a broken psyche adrift in a sea of pain. The plea for help Kaelin had heard was not an isolated event, but one of countless such fragments, a desperate signal sent from a mind that could no longer cohere. The most chilling accounts were not of the machine or the Emperor, but of the adepts themselves. He read of men and women who, upon learning the truth, had simply walked into the plasma furnaces. Others had begun screaming and never stopped, their minds unraveled by the revelation. One log detailed an adept who had tried to expose the truth to the High Lords, only to be dragged away by the custodians, his final transmission a burst of static that sounded like laughter. These were not weaklings. They were the best of the Mechanicus, chosen for their fortitude and faith. The truth had been a psychic virus, and it had driven them all mad. Kalen felt the same virus working in him, a cold dread coiling around his spine as he realized he was reading his own potential future in their ruined lives. He could not let this knowledge exist. It was too dangerous for the Imperium and for his own fragile sanity. With a grim resolve, he gathered the scrolls and data wafers into a pile in the center of the hidden chamber. He produced his igniter, the tool used for sanctifying rituals, and with a hand that trembled only slightly, he touched the flame to the brittle parchment. The fire took hold greedily, the orange light dancing on the walls, consuming centuries of forbidden insight. The words of Lysander and Alara and all the others turned to smoke and ash, their truths returning to the void from which they came. But burning the evidence did not burn the knowledge from his mind. As he watched the flames consume the physical records, the truths they contained etched themselves deeper into his consciousness. The image of the failing star, the shattered mirror of the Emperor's mind, the madness of his predecessors, these became the new pillars of his reality. He emerged from the hidden archive covered in soot and reeking of smoke, but it was the internal contamination that marked him. He saw heresy in every shadow, conspiracy in every glance from his fellow adepts. The low hum of the throne was no longer the breath of a god, but the death rattle of a patient on a mortuary slab, and he was the only one in the room who could hear it. The paranoia was a cage closing around him, and he had thrown away the key. The hidden archive's ashes still clung to his robes, a gritty, tactile reminder of the truths he had tried and failed to erase. The knowledge was a parasite in his mind, feeding on his faith and excreting a cold, constant dread. He could not speak of it, not to Vorel, not to any of the other adepts who moved through their duties with the placid, bovine acceptance of those who had chosen not to see. There was only one name, whispered in the darkest corners of the forgotten data logs, a specter of forbidden knowledge that the desperate and the damned sought out. They called him the Oracle. Finding him was a descent into a deeper layer of the palace's madness. Kalen followed directions gleaned from a fragmented, half-coated data wafer, navigating service corridors that had not seen maintenance in centuries, where the air was thick with rust particles and the silence was a physical presence. The final passage was a narrow fissure between two colossal structural members, a crack in the world that led to a sealed chamber door of pitted black iron. There was no handle, no keypad, only a single human skull set into the metal at eye level, its hollow socket seeming to watch his approach. Remembering the instructions, Kalen placed his palm against the cold, smooth bone of the skull's forehead. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of metal that sounded like a dying man's last breath, the door slid sideways into the wall, revealing only darkness and a smell that made the stench of the throne's decay seem almost wholesome, the dry, ancient odor of bone dust and static. The chamber within was a reliquary of the damned. Skulls lined the walls from floor to ceiling, a mosaic of silent, screaming mouths and vacant eyes. They were not arranged with any ritualistic order, but stacked and piled with a frantic, obsessive chaos. Some were ancient, yellowed and cracked with age, while others still bore scraps of desiccated flesh and the glint of metallic neural jacks. In the center of the room, seated on a throne of fused vertebrae, was the Oracle. He was less a man and more a collection of parts, a withered body swathed in robes the color of dried blood, his face a web of deep wrinkles from which two augmetic eyes glowed with a soft blue light. Wires snaked from ports in his skull to sockets in the bone-pile throne, connecting him to his macabre chorus. Kalen did not need to speak. The Oracle's voice, a dry rasp that seemed to emanate from the very skulls around them, filled the silence. It was not a single voice, but a chorus of whispers layered over one another, the echoes of all the minds whose remains decorated his sanctum. He confirmed everything. The throne was not merely decaying, it was in its final, catastrophic decline. The corrosion Kalen had witnessed was a symptom of a systemic failure, a cascading collapse of arcane systems that had been pushed far beyond their designed limits. The psychic fluctuations were not anomalies but death throes. The Emperor's fragmented consciousness was not a state of divine transcendence, but the result of a psyche being systematically shredded across 10 millennia, a mind trapped in a feedback loop of its own unending agony. Then the Oracle delivered the final, galaxy-shattering verdict. The throne's failure was not a possibility, it was imminent. The delicate balance it maintained was unraveling, and when it finally snapped, the resulting psychic collapse would be an event of apocalyptic proportions. The Astronomicon would be extinguished, plunging the Imperium into navigational darkness. But worse, far worse, the great rift in the warp that the Emperor's will currently held at bay would tear open across the heart of Terra itself. The demonic legions waiting on the other side would flood into reality, and humanity, blinded and leaderless, would be consumed in a storm of fire and madness. The Imperium of Man was not eternal. It was a flickering candle in a hurricane, and the wind was rising. As the chorus of whispers fell silent, the Oracle's skeletal hand emerged from his robes, clutching a slender black data slate. Its surface was not glass and plasteel, but a non-reflective obsidian, cold and unnaturally heavy. Carved into its frame were symbols so ancient they predated the Imperium itself. This, the Oracle rasped, was not a record of the throne's failure but a memory of its creation. It contained the original schematics, the pure, uncorrupted design of the machine as its ancient, forgotten architects had intended it. It was a ghost of a time before it became a torture device, a tomb, and a time bomb. The Oracle pressed the slate into Kalen's hands, the contact sending a jolt of frigid energy up his arms. The weight of the object was nothing compared to the weight of the knowledge it represented. It was not a solution, but a testament to how far they had fallen, a blueprint for a salvation that was 10,000 years too late. It began not as a sound, but as a pressure drop in the soul. The constant, low hum of the golden throne, the ever-present backdrop to every moment of Kalen's existence, suddenly ceased. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was not peaceful, but predatory, a held breath before the shriek. For a single, heart-stopping second, every adept in the vast chamber froze, their hands hovering over consoles, their heads cocked as if listening to a frequency only the damned could hear. Then the storm broke. It was a psychic detonation of pure, unfiltered agony. The air in the chamber visibly shimmered, warping like heat haze over a desert, and a wave of force, invisible and silent, threw Kalen back against his console. The impact was physical, but the true assault was on his mind. The carefully constructed mental shields, the rituals of focus and denial that had allowed him to function, shattered into a million glittering fragments. The whispers became a unified, world-ending roar. The residual pain of the sacrificed, the fragmented consciousness of the Emperor, the collective terror of a species. It all erupted at once, a geyser of torment flooding the sanctum. Hallucinations bloomed in the air like poisonous flowers. The sterile, metallic walls of the control chamber melted away, replaced by vistas of unimaginable horror. Kalen saw worlds burning, not with natural fire, but with emerald warp flame that consumed stone and soul alike. Cities of gold and marble crumbled into dust, their populations dissolving into screaming silhouettes against the inferno. The faces of the dead, the billions fed to the throne, pressed in around him, their features stretched in eternal screams, their eyes burning with accusation, and a pain so profound it had become their only identity. He saw the skeletal, rotting form of the Emperor not as a static icon, but writhing in a silent, endless convulsion upon the throne, each tremor a fresh wave of suffering that rippled out across the galaxy. He was not alone in his torment. All around him, his fellow adepts were breaking. One man clawed at his own face, shrieking about spiders made of light crawling under his skin. Another had drawn a sanctified blade and was methodically hacking at a bank of consoles as if they were demonic flesh. Senior Adept Vorl stood rigid, his hands clamped over his crystal lens eyes, a low, continuous moan escaping his lips, the embodiment of doctrine utterly undone. The collective sanity of the throne's guardians, a bulwark maintained for 10,000 years, was being sandblasted away by the raw, screaming truth of what they served. For Kalen, the visions narrowed, focusing into a single, harrowing tapestry. He saw the Emperor's suffering not as a historical event, but as a continuous, conscious experience, an eternity of feeling every soul being torn apart, of tasting the despair of each sacrifice, of holding back an ocean of madness with a mind that was itself a shattered mosaic of pain. It was not a noble sacrifice, but an infinite torture, and woven through the Emperor's agony was the infinite pain of the sacrifice themselves. He felt the precise moment of each unmaking, not as a statistic, but as a unique and terrible extinction. The scholar's last thought for his lost books, the mother's final cry for her child, the soldier's fading grip on a forgotten oath. Their individual terrors were not erased upon consumption. They were absorbed, added to the great screaming chorus that was the throne's true voice. The storm did not pass so much as it exhausted itself, the psychic tsunami receding to leave behind a wreckage of broken minds and shattered faith. The hum of the throne returned, but it was different now, ragged, strained, a wounded beast licking its wounds. The air still crackled with the aftershocks of torment. Kalen slid down the console to the floor, his body trembling, his robes soaked with a cold sweat. The hallucinations were gone, but the knowledge they had imparted was seared into him. The agony was not a byproduct of the process. It was the process. It was the fundamental force that permeated this reality, the currency in which the Imperium's survival was purchased. And he understood with a chilling finality that his own sanity was just another resource to be spent, another brick in the wall against the screaming dark, slowly eroding to nothing. The silence after the storm was a liar's peace. The psychic tempest had receded, but its residue clung to the chamber like a psychic mold, a fine, invisible dust of despair that settled over every surface and every soul. Kalen moved through his duties as an automaton, his hands performing the rote rituals of maintenance and monitoring, but his mind was a fractured landscape, a battlefield where the last vestiges of his faith waged a hopeless war against the crushing weight of truth. The visions of the screaming storm had not been an anomaly. They had been a glimpse behind the final curtain, a revelation of the raw, screaming agony that was the foundation of his universe. His belief in the Omnissiah, the machine god whose divine logic underpinned all creation, now felt like a childish fantasy, a story told to soothe the damned before the lights went out. In the suffocating privacy of his cell, he attempted to pray. Kneeling on the cold stone floor, he focused his mind, trying to channel his thoughts through the prescribed litanies of devotion, to feel the comforting presence of the divine logic that had guided him since his first days on Mars. But the prayers, once a source of order and strength, now rang hollow, their meaning stripped away by the screams he could not unhear. He reached out with his spirit, seeking the Omnissiah and the sacred machinery around him, and found only echoes. The hum of the power conduits was the groan of a dying beast. The flicker of the console lights was the frantic, fading pulse of a terminal patient. The silence that answered his entreaties was not the profound quiet of a god, but the empty, mocking silence of the void. He was praying into a tomb, and the only thing listening was the torment he helped to perpetuate. A desperate, reckless thought began to take root in the barren soil of his shattered faith. He could expose it. He could gather the evidence. The corrupted conduit shard pulsing in its hiding place, the memory, the oracle's warnings, the first-hand account of the screaming storm, and bring it before the high lords of Terra. He could tear down the veil of lies and force the Imperium to gaze upon the rotting, agonized truth of its own god. The fantasy was intoxicating, a flare of righteous purpose in the overwhelming dark. For a few fleeting hours, he clung to it, imagining himself as the one who would shatter the great lie, no matter the cost. But the fantasy curdled as quickly as it had bloomed. The cost. He contemplated it with a cold, clinical horror. He would not be hailed as a savior or a prophet. He would be branded a heretic, his mind and his testimony the products of warp-induced insanity. His fate would not be a podium before the high lords, but an interrogation chamber deep beneath the palace, a place where the custodians peeled back a man's sanity layer by layer to find the rot within. His end would be a silent, anonymous execution, his body fed into the same furnaces that consumed the failed psychers, his name expunged from all records. He would become nothing, and the great grinding machine of the Imperium would continue, unmoved and unrepentant, its foundations built upon the bones of those who had learned the truth and been silenced. The desire for revelation was a luxury his terror could not afford. The weight of his isolation became unbearable. He needed to share the burden, to hear another voice confirm the nightmare, or better yet, to deny it, and offer him a way back to the comforting blindness of doctrine. His feet carried him to Senior Adept Voral's private cell before he had even consciously decided to go. He found the older adept not at prayer or rest, but simply standing before a blank wall, his back to the door. The rigid, uncompromising posture was still there, the carapace of doctrine worn like armor. Kalen drew a breath, the confession, the plea for absolution or complicity poised on his lips. "Voral," he began, his voice a ragged whisper. Voral turned slowly. The movement was devoid of its usual sharp precision, and in that moment Kalen saw it. The crystal lens eyes, usually so sharp and dismissive, were not looking at him, but through him. They were hollow, two polished stones washed up on a shore of utter exhaustion. The lines on Voral's face were not just marks of age, but fissures carved by a knowledge that had eaten him from the inside out. There was no curiosity in his gaze, no expectation, only a profound, soul-deep weariness, the look of a man who had long since stopped hoping for answers or redemption. He knew, he had always known. The rigid doctrine, the furious denial of decay, the brutal enforcement of silence, it was not the product of blind faith but the desperate performance of it. Voral was not a believer. He was a fellow prisoner, a warden of a hell he was condemned to share. The words died in Kaelin's throat. There was nothing to confess that Vorel did not already understand, no horror he had not already catalogued and locked away in the hollows of his own mind. To speak would be to shatter the fragile, unspoken pact that allowed them both to continue their work. It would be to acknowledge the shared complicity that was the only thing holding their world together. Kaelin gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture not of greeting, but of recognition. Vorel's eyes held his for a second longer, a silent communication of mutual damnation, then turned back to the blank wall. Kaelin retreated, the door sliding shut behind him, leaving him alone in the corridor. He was more isolated than ever, but the nature of his solitude had changed. He was not a lone heretic in a world of believers. He was one more soul in a chorus of the damned, all singing the same silent, screaming hymn to a dying God. The first sign was a flicker, a momentary dimming of the throne's internal light that plunged the vast chamber into a twilight of dread. For a heartbeat, the psychic hum faltered, stuttering like a failing heart. Then the alarms began. They were not the simple, functional chimes that signaled the ritual of feeding, but a shrieking, multitonal cacophony that tore through the sanctum imperialis, a sound of pure, undiluted panic. Crimson lumen strips embedded in the walls and floor ignited, painting the chamber in the color of fresh blood, their light strobing in time with the screaming klaxons. The air, already thick with ozone and despair, began to curdle. A greasy, iridescent sheen shimmered into existence, distorting the solid lines of the machinery, making the very air seem to sweat with unreality. At his console, Kaelin felt the shift not through his instruments, but in his bones. The data streams were a riot of screaming red glyphs and spiraling failure warnings, but the true horror was in the warp. The delicate, agonizingly maintained barrier between the material world and the Empyrean was tearing. A psychic wind, cold and smelling of blood and static, howled through the chamber, snatching at robes and sending loose data slates skittering across the floor. The whispers of the sacrificed, usually a background chorus, swelled into a deafening roar of terror and anticipation. Reality itself was becoming soft, malleable. The adamantium deck plates beneath his feet seemed to ripple like water, and from the corners of the chamber, where the blood-red light did not reach, elongated shadows began to twitch and writhe with a life of their own. Adepts scrambled in a frenzy of controlled terror. Robed figures darted between consoles, their movements frantic, their faces pale masks of horror beneath their hoods. Some were frozen in place, staring at the warping air as their minds tried and failed to process the impossible. Others worked with a desperate, feverish energy, their hands flying across control panels, chanting litanies of activation and stabilization that were swallowed by the rising din. Senior Adept Vorel was a pillar of grim purpose amidst the chaos. His voice, a bullhorn of command, bellowing orders that were half drowned by the shriek of the alarms and the groaning of the tortured machine. But even his authority could not stop the tide. A section of the wall near a primary energy conduit bulged outward, the stone and plasteel flowing like heated wax before rupturing in a silent, violet flash. Through the tear, not the substructure of the palace, but a swirling vortex of impossible colors and shrieking faces could be seen, a raw wound in reality, pouring demonic potential into the heart of the Imperium. Kaelin did not think. He acted. He saw the rupture, a gaping maw of screaming unreality, and he knew it had to be sealed. He sprinted towards it, the deck heaving under his feet, the psychic wind trying to tear him from his path. He grabbed a melt-a-charge from an emergency locker, its weight a comforting solidity in his hands. The air around the breach was freezing, and the sound was a physical pressure, a chorus of maddening whispers that promised oblivion. He armed the charge, his fingers numb with cold and fear, and hurled it into the heart of the shimmering tier. The explosion was a contained sun, a blast of pure, cleansing heat that momentarily banished the unreality. The vortex collapsed in on itself with a sound like a dying sob, the tier in reality sealing over with a scar of molten rock and fused metal. A collective, shuddering sigh seemed to pass through the adepts, but the victory was not clean. The backlash of warp energy from the closing breach washed over the chamber like a tidal wave. A servitor, one of the silent, mindless laborers tasked with menial duties, was caught in the full force of the blast. It froze in mid-step, its polished bone and metal frame shuddering violently. Then its blank, optic lens face twitched. A spasm racked its body, and its jaw, never designed for speech, unhinged. A voice that was not its own, a high, terrified, and distinctly human wail, tore from its vocalizer. "Unit, don't let it take me. Not the light, not the light." The voice was that of the young psyker from the feeding ritual, the one whose eyes had met Kaelin's. It was a perfect, agonizing echo of that final, damning moment of understanding. The servitor's limbs flailed in a grotesque parody of life, its movements no longer mechanical, but the frantic, uncoordinated thrashing of a soul in torment. For 3 long, horrifying seconds, the ghost of the sacrificed psyker animated the metal shell, a brief, violent possession that laid bare the true horror of their work. Then, as suddenly as it began, the fit ended. The servitor slumped to the floor, a heap of inert metal and bone, its vocalizer emitting only a faint, dying crackle of static. The breach was sealed, the immediate threat averted. But a different kind of rupture had been opened, one that no melt-a-charge could ever fix. The line between machine and soul, between sacrifice and slavery, had been irrevocably crossed, and the ghost of a scream now hung in the air, a permanent resident in the tomb of the Golden Throne. The ghost in the machine had spoken, and its single, stolen shriek hung in the air long after the possessed servitor had fallen still. The breach was sealed, a smoldering scar of fused metal and stone, but the fragile reality of the Sanctum Imperialis had been punctured, and the Terror was bleeding through. The klaxons continued their mindless shrieking, but now a new, more urgent sound joined the cacophony, the deep, resonant groan of the Golden Throne itself. It was a sound of structural failure, the death rattle of a god engine pushed past its breaking point. The strobing crimson lights painted the frantic adepts in snapshots of panic, their movements jerky and disjointed as they fought a war on 2 fronts, against the failing machinery and against the unraveling of their own sanity. Senior Adept Voral's voice cut through the chaos, stripped of all its former dogma and cold certainty, reduced to a raw, functional rasp. He barked coordinates, citing emergency protocols so ancient and dire they had never been uttered aloud. The command was simple, monstrous, and absolute. The stabilization protocol. It required a direct, massive infusion of psychic energy, a jolt to the heart of the dying machine. The order was given without emotion, a necessary calculation in a ledger of souls. The daily tithe of psychers would not suffice. The required number was double. The words landed in the chamber not as a command, but as a physical blow. The horror of the breach was now eclipsed by the horror of the solution. Kaelin's assigned station was at the primary soul-feeding console, a position of terrible honor he had never coveted. The console was a beautiful, horrifying thing of ivory and gold, inlaid with circuits of silver that pulsed with a soft, hungry light. His role was to oversee the final sequence, to initiate the mechanism that would guide the amplified sacrifice into the throne's starving maw. His hands, sheathed in fine electro-lace gloves, hovered over the activation runes. They trembled, a fine, constant vibration that had nothing to do with the shuddering deck. He watched the main oculus as the first group was led in. They were not the usual broken procession. The number was overwhelming, a sea of gray shifts and terrified faces that filled the amphitheater below. The sight was a gut punch, a magnitude of suffering that defied comprehension. The ritual began. There was no time for the usual grim solemnity. It was an execution on an industrial scale. The soul engines whined to life, their hum pitched high with strain. The column of light on the dais intensified, blazing with a cold, white fury. Kaelin's finger pressed the first rune. Below, the first row of psychers was enveloped. The dissolution was not individual this time, but a collective unmasking. A dozen bodies blurred at the edges, their forms dissolving into a swirling storm of golden motes. But the psychic backlash was not a series of individual screams. It was a single, sustained chord of agony, a wave of such pure, concentrated torment that it felt like the universe itself was being flayed. Kaelin's mind, still raw from the screaming storm, was battered by it. He tasted blood, realizing he had bitten his own lip. His hands moved to the next sequence, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy. Each rune he activated was a verdict, a death sentence for a dozen more souls. He was the conductor of this orchestra of extinction. He saw their faces in the oculus, a kaleidoscope of human emotion, resignation, defiance, sheer animal terror, each one wiped from existence by the movement of his hand. He felt every one of them go. It was not a distant observation, it was a visceral experience. A young girl's last memory of a doll, a soldier's final thought of his home world, a scholar's fading grasp on a beautiful equation. Each one flashed through his mind and was extinguished. Their unique consciousnesses shredded into raw, screaming fuel. The console before him was slick, and he realized with a distant horror that it was not condensation, but sweat from his own palms, beating on the gold. He operated the soul-feeding mechanisms, his movements becoming a robotic pantomime of duty. The trembling in his hands was a constant now, a physical manifestation of the moral earthquake happening within. He was no longer an adept of the Mechanicus performing a holy rite. He was a butcher at a slaughterhouse, levering lives into a furnace to keep a greater horror at bay. The utilitarian calculus was inescapable. The immediate survival of the Imperium, the prevention of a demonic incursion that would consume billions, demanded this specific, quantified horror. The cost was 1,000 souls, their eternal damnation in this machine, to buy another day for a galaxy built on the same principle. It was the only choice, and in its absolute brutal necessity, it was a damnation of its own. He was not saving humanity. He was perpetuating the very engine of its damnation, and his trembling hands were the instruments of that eternal, screaming truth. The last rune was pressed. The final psychic scream echoed and faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more terrible than any sound. The throne groan softened to its familiar, strained hum. It was stabilized. The breach was contained. And Kaelin stood at his console, his soul feeling as hollow and scorched as the dais below, a permanent witness to the day he had traded a piece of his own humanity to keep the nightmare alive. The data slate was a cold, dark weight against Kaelin's hip, a shard of obsidian truth in a world of gilded lies. The desperate repair had stabilized the throne, but it had shattered something fundamental within him. The memory of his own hands feeding 1,000 souls into the screaming machine was a brand on his soul, a permanent testament to his complicity. He could no longer function on the faith that had been stripped from him, layer by layer like flesh from bone. The Oracle's final gift was no longer a choice. It was a compulsion, the only path forward in a world that had become a prison of horrors. He waited for the depth of the sleep cycle, when the sanctum's activity dwindled to a ghost of its daytime frenzy. The corridors were empty, the only movement the dance of shadows cast by flickering lumens. The data slate felt alive in his hand, its surface unnaturally cool. He activated it, and instead of a screen of light, a three-dimensional schematic of the palace's substructure bloomed into the air above it, rendered in lines of faint, silver luminescence. It was a map of a forgotten age, showing passages and chambers that had been sealed for millennia. A single, pulsing point of red light indicated his location, and a route, like a thread of blood, wove through the labyrinth, leading him away from the main thoroughfares and into the ossified arteries of the palace's deepest foundations. He followed the ghostly trail, his footsteps echoing in suffocating silence. The way led through maintenance ducts choked with dust, across chasms on narrow, crumbling catwalks, and finally to a featureless stretch of wall in a sublevel so deep the air was stale and motionless. According to the slate, a chamber lay directly behind it. He ran his hands over the seamless stone, feeling nothing but cool, unyielding rock. Despair began to creep in when his fingers, guided by some instinct, found a sequence of almost imperceptible depressions, their pattern matching a constellation of glyphs on the slate's edge. He pressed them in the order the slate dictated. There was no groan of machinery, no hiss of hydraulics. A section of the wall simply shimmered and vanished, revealing a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the light from his lumen. The air that sighed out was ancient, carrying the scent of dry rust and something else, the faint psychic residue of profound and final despair. He stepped inside and the wall solidified behind him, sealing him in a tomb of truth. His lumen globe flickered to life, its beam revealing a small, circular chamber. There were no skulls, no piles of scrolls. In the center sat a single, monolithic console of black basalt, its surface smooth and unadorned. Set into its top was a recess that perfectly matched the shape of the Oracle's data slate. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the overwhelming silence. This was it, the source, the genesis of the lie. With trembling hands, he placed the slate into the recess. It clicked into place with a sound of finality. The basalt console awoke. Light, not from a screen but from within the stone itself, began to pulse in a slow, rhythmic pattern. A voice, clear and devoid of the Oracle's layered whispers, filled the chamber. It was a recording, the voice of its creator, calm, logical, and freighted with a terrible sadness. It spoke not of gods, but of engineering. It described the Golden Throne not as a divine engine, but as a temporary life support system and psychic amplifier, a desperate stopgap measure conceived in the final, catastrophic hours of a war that had nearly extinguished humanity. It was never meant for prolonged use. Its purpose was to stabilize a mortally wounded man, the Emperor, long enough to enact a permanent solution, a grand work that had died with the Imperium's founding. The voice detailed the systems with a chilling clarity. The soul energy conversion matrices were not a holy mystery, but a brutal, inefficient process that caused unimaginable agony to the subject. The life support functions were a continuous, invasive torture, a constant battle against entropy that systematically broke down the body and mind it was meant to preserve. The logs confirmed the horror Kaelin had witnessed with his own eyes. The Emperor was not a silent god in transcendent meditation. His physical form was a corpse, artificially animated by systems that were themselves decaying. And his consciousness was a prisoner. The throne did not grant him godhood. It trapped him in a state of perpetual conscious agony. He felt every soul sacrificed, experienced every moment of their unmaking, his own shattered psyche woven into the fabric of their torment. It was not a sacrifice of noble silence, but an eternal, screaming vigil in a torture chamber of his own making. The final log entry was the most devastating. It was a single, stark sentence, delivered with the flat tone of a scientist recording the failure of an experiment. The subject's consciousness remains fully cognizant. The pain is eternal. There is no release. The words echoed in the silent chamber, and then in the silent hollow of Kaelin's soul. The last vestiges of his faith, the fragile scaffolding that had somehow survived the screaming storm and the desperate repair, crumbled into dust. He was not a priest tending a god. He was a jailer, a torturer's apprentice. Every ritual he had performed, every console he had monitored, every soul he had fed into the engines, had been an act of perpetuating this unending cycle of agony. He had not been sustaining the Imperium. He had been turning the wheel of a rack on which its god was eternally stretched. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, broken thing that was half sob, half gasp. He sank to his knees on the cold stone floor, his body folding in on itself as the weight of the revelation crushed him. The tears came then, not the quiet tears of sadness, but great heaving sobs that racked his entire frame. They were tears of grief for the Emperor, the man trapped in an eternity of hell. They were tears of horror for the countless sacrificed, their suffering made meaningless by this damning truth. And they were tears of utter, profound shame for himself. He wept for his own lost innocence, for the eager adept who had descended into this place believing in honor and purpose, only to discover that his role was to be a cog in the greatest machine of torture the galaxy had ever known. He knelt in the dark, the ghost of 10,000 years of screams his only company, and wept until there was nothing left, hollowed out by the terrible, unveiled truth. The truth was a stone in his gut, an immovable weight that anchored him to the floor of the hidden chamber long after his tears had dried. The sobs had subsided, leaving behind a cavernous emptiness, a silence within himself that was more profound than the tomb-like quiet around him. The revelation was complete, the final, terrible piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The golden throne was not a divine engine. It was a torture device of unimaginable cruelty. The Emperor was not a silent god. He was a conscious, suffering prisoner. And Kaelin, adept of the Mechanicus, was not a guardian of faith. He was a warden of this eternal, screaming hell. He rose on unsteady legs, his body feeling alien and heavy. The obsidian data slate lay dark and inert in its basalt cradle, its terrible work done. He retrieved it, the cold of the stone seeming to leach the last vestiges of warmth from his hands. He had to leave this place, this sanctum of ultimate heresy. But to leave was to carry the knowledge with him, and that knowledge was a weapon more destructive than any virus bomb. It was a seed that, if planted in the fertile soil of the Imperium, would not grow a tree of truth, but a galaxy-spanning firestorm of panic and despair. He emerged from the hidden chamber, the wall sealing behind him with a whisper of displaced reality, and began the long, numb walk back towards the inhabited levels. With every step, the choice crystallized in his mind, a binary equation with two equally horrific solutions. On one side was the truth. He could take the data slate, the corrupted conduit shard, the memory of the oracle's words, and his own first-hand testimony, and present it to someone with the power to be heard. He could expose the great lie. He could scream the truth into the deafening silence of the Imperium. The value of that truth was absolute. It was the right of every human soul to know the nature of the God they worshipped, the true cost of their survival. It was a debt owed to the Emperor himself, a chance, however faint, to end his infinite suffering. But the cost was a calculation that froze the blood in his veins. The Imperium of Man was not a society built on reason. It was a fortress built on faith. Its unity was a brittle thing, maintained by the absolute, unshakable belief in the God Emperor and his divine plan. To reveal that the God Emperor was a rotting, eternally tortured corpse, that his golden throne was a failing engine of agony, would be to pull the keystone from the arch. The Astronomicon was not just a light, it was a symbol of hope. The Imperial Creed was not just a religion, it was the glue that held 1,000,000 worlds together. To shatter those symbols would be to plunge the entire galaxy into a darkness far deeper than the one the throne held at bay. There would be no reasoned debate, no galactic awakening. There would be panic. Heresy would bloom on every world. The fragile alliances of the Imperium would shatter into 1,000,000 warring factions. The demonic legions waiting in the warp would find a galaxy ripe for the taking. Its defenses collapsed from within. The cost of the truth was the annihilation of humanity itself. Billions, trillions of lives, extinguished in a storm of anarchy and blood, all for the sake of a truth they could not possibly bear. He reached his sparse, functional cell and stood in the center of the room, the data slate held in his hands. He looked at it, this sliver of obsidian that contained the blueprint for the apocalypse. He weighed the value of a single, absolute truth against the weight of 1,000,000,000,000 lives. He imagined the fires, the screams, the collapse of 10,000 years of civilization. All because he, Kalen, had chosen to speak. The image of the young psyker from the feeding ritual, her eyes locked with his in that moment of shared understanding, flashed before him. Was her sacrifice, and the sacrifice of 1,000 like her every day, to be rendered meaningless in a final, catastrophic orgy of truth? Fear decided it. Not a fear for his own life, though that was a cold, sharp presence in his gut, but a fear so vast it encompassed the entire galaxy. It was the terror of being the man who pulled the thread that unraveled creation. The responsibility was too great, the potential carnage too horrific. The truth was a luxury that a dying universe could not afford. The lie was a burden that had to be borne, a cross for all of humanity to carry forever. His hands moved with a grim, final resolve. He placed the obsidian data slate on the floor. From his toolkit, he produced a multi-melta, the tool used for emergency cutting and smelting. He adjusted the setting to its most concentrated, hottest beam. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and ashes, and pulled the trigger. A pencil-thin beam of incandescent white light lanced out, striking the center of the slate. The ancient, impossibly durable material did not melt or burn. It sublimated, turning directly from solid to a plume of shimmering black vapor that dissipated into nothingness. In seconds, the Oracle's final gift, the last pure record of the original sin, was gone, erased from existence. He then retrieved the shard of corrupted conduit from its hiding place. It pulsed in his palm, a faint, malignant rhythm. He held it over the same spot on the floor and unleashed the multi-melter again. The metal glowed cherry red, then white hot, before liquefying into a sizzling puddle that quickly cooled into a featureless, blackened slag. The physical evidence was destroyed. He stood in the silence of his cell, the multi-melter cooling in his hand. He had made his choice. He had chosen the lie. He had chosen silence. He had condemned the Emperor to an eternity of conscious agony and himself to an eternity of complicity, all to preserve a galaxy that lived in blissful, necessary ignorance. But as the last traces of the vapor faded from the air, he made one final silent vow. He would remember. He would carry the horror within him, not as a poison, but as a sacred, damning burden. He would be the guardian of the truth he had just destroyed, the lone rememberer in a world of forgetfulness. He would bear witness to the screams, to the rotting flesh, to the infinite pain, so that someone somewhere would know the terrible price of their continued existence. The lie would live on, but the truth would not be entirely forgotten. It would fester in his soul, a canker of perfect, horrifying knowledge for as long as he drew breath. The silence was the loudest sound Kalen had ever heard. It was not an absence of noise, for the golden throne still groaned its low, perpetual dirge, and the machinery around him clicked and hissed with its usual, arcane functions. This was a deeper silence, an internal hollowness that had swallowed the psychic screams, the whispered pleas, the very horror that had once vibrated through his every nerve. He moved through the Sanctum Imperialis as a ghost in his own body, his hands performing the familiar rituals of monitoring and maintenance with an automaton's precision. The console before him, once a window into a universe of torment, was now just a panel of lights and data streams. The crimson river representing the soul energy of the sacrificed psychers flowed smoothly, a statistic to be logged, not a symphony of agony to be endured. The psychic pressure that had once felt like a physical weight on his skull was now a distant hum, a background radiation to which he had become permanently, terribly numb. He checked the subconduit accessways, the same cramped passages where he had first discovered the weeping corrosion. The junction was still there, the blackish, weeping scar on the gold-plated pipe, now a familiar landmark, like a crack in a well-traveled path. He noted its stable, if foul, presence in his log, the words devoid of the frantic horror that had once accompanied them. It was simply a fact. The throne was decaying. The knowledge was no longer a shocking revelation, but a fundamental axiom of his existence, as undeniable and unremarkable as the law of gravity. The soul-crushing weight of the forbidden knowledge had not vanished. It had simply become a part of his skeleton, the very framework that held him upright. He carried it not as a burden, but as his new, permanent shape. His shift ended, and he filed out of the control chamber with the other adepts, a stream of crimson robes moving in a silent, processional march. In the antechamber, he encountered Senior Adept Voral. The older adept was inspecting a data slate, his brow furrowed in its usual mask of grim diligence. In the past, their interactions had been charged with unspoken tension, a silent war between Kaelin's desperate curiosity and Voral's rigid doctrine. Now, as Kaelin approached to give his end-of-shift report, something different passed between them. Voral looked up, and their eyes met for a fleeting second. It was not a meeting of gazes, but a mutual, instantaneous deflection. Both pairs of eyes skittered away, fixing on a point on the wall just past the other's shoulder. There were no words, no nod of acknowledgement. The avoidance was a perfect, synchronized dance, a ritual more deeply understood than any prayer to the Omnissiah. In that shared, deliberate failure to connect, Kaelin saw the entirety of their complicity. Voral's hollow eyes were not just a sign of exhaustion. They were the windows to a soul that had made the same calculation, borne the same weight, and chosen the same silence. The furious denial, the rigid enforcement of doctrine, it had all been a performance, a desperate pantomime to maintain the lie they were both condemned to uphold. They were not superior and subordinate, not believer and heretic. They were fellow inmates in an asylum of their own making, bound together by the terrible knowledge that they were the guardians of a dying god's torture chamber. The erosion of their humanity was not a side effect of their service. It was the prerequisite for it. To remain sane, to continue the work, they had to become less than human, to sand away the parts of themselves that could feel horror, pity, or despair. They had to become extensions of the very machine they served, efficient, numb, and eternally complicit. Kalen completed his report in a monotone, his voice as empty as his soul. Vorl grunted an acknowledgement without looking at him, his attention returning to the data slate. The interaction was over. There was no conflict, no tension, only the vast, silent understanding of their shared damnation. As Kalen turned to leave for his cell, he felt no anger towards Vorl, no resentment. There was only a profound, weary kinship. They were two men standing watch over a corpse, polishing the bars of a cage they would never leave. Their only solace the knowledge that they were not alone in the silence. The screams of the sacrificed were gone from his ears, but the quiet between him and Vorl was now the loudest sound in the universe, a roaring testament to everything they had lost and everything they had chosen to preserve. The silence had become a symphony, its movements composed of the throne's low, grinding hum, the rhythmic click of cooling vents, and the faint, psychic static that was the ghost of a billion screams. Kalen stood at his console, his hands resting on the cool, polished surface, his gaze fixed on the luminous data streams that charted the final, slow death of a god. There was no more foreboding, no more horror, no more desperate struggle between faith and truth. There was only the vigil. This console, this chamber, this eternal grinding machine, this was the entirety of his world now, the borders of a life that would be spent hour by hour, year by year, maintaining the horror he had once fought to understand. He watched the flow of energy, the crimson river of soul stuff that poured ceaselessly into the maw of the golden throne. Each flicker on the schematic represented a life extinguished, a consciousness unmade. Once each of those flickers had been a psychic shriek that tore at his sanity, a unique and terrible extinction that he felt in the core of his being. Now they were simply data points. The screams were still there, echoing in the warp, a chorus of the damned that would continue long after the stars had burned out. But to Kalen, they were a familiar backdrop, the white noise of his existence, as natural and unremarkable as the sound of his own breathing. He had not overcome the horror. He had absorbed it, made it a part of his own cellular structure until he could no longer distinguish where the machine's agony ended and his own began. His eyes lifted from the console, drawn across the vast, shadowed expanse of the chamber to the distant, pulsating heart of the machine. The golden throne was a mountain of gilded machinery, its spires and conduits gleaming dully in the low light. It was the engine of humanity's salvation, the bulwark against the dark. But he knew the truth that lay beneath the gold and the sanctified oils. He saw the rotting form, the weeping sores, the conscious, eternal suffering. He saw the great, grinding gears of a faith built on a foundation of infinite pain. And he wondered, not for the first time, if the species huddling in the light of this terrible beacon truly deserved to be saved. Was a civilization worth preserving if its continued existence demanded this endless, screaming holocaust? Was their survival a triumph of the human spirit, or the ultimate damning proof of its corruption? The questions had no answers, and he had long since stopped seeking them. They were simply part of the landscape of his mind, as permanent and unchangeable as the throne itself. The machine groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the deck plates and up through the bones of his feet. It was the sound of a great weight settling, of systems straining under an impossible burden. It was the sound of eternity. In that moment, as the familiar noise filled the chamber, a final, quiet act of rebellion stirred within the hollowed-out shell of his soul. His lips, chapped and dry, moved without sound at first. Then a whisper escaped, so faint it was lost beneath the throne's groan. It was not a prayer to the emperor, the silent, suffering prisoner on the throne. It was not a litany to the Omnissiah, the distant, absent god of the machine. It was a whisper for the forgotten, for the unmourned, for the countless billions whose souls had been shredded into fuel and whose names had been erased from history. For the lost, he breathed, the words a ghost on. The stagnant air, for the sacrificed, for the screams in the dark, remember them. It was not a plea for salvation or forgiveness,